Welcome to the Savage GM Hangout podcast on air. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's episode sponsored by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Go check them out at Roll20.net. Tonight we're going to talk about doing fantasy in Savage Worlds. Now, the conventional wisdom in the community is if you have first-time players, wave off fantasy. Don't do it. Stay away from it because they're gonna try to draw comparisons and correlations to Savage Worlds. I'm gonna say that you face that in any thing you're gonna try to run for first-time players of another popular system, be it Shadowrun or any other type of system. If their only exposure is to one type of system, they come to Savage Worlds, there's going to be comparisons.
Yeah, I guess it's inevitable.
So, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're playing Firefly Cortex or Dresden Files Fate. If you're trying to run Dresden Files in Savage Worlds, there's going to be comparisons. So, to that, we say, screw that advice. Go for it. Savage Worlds will run fantasy beautifully. It will not do D&D. Now, here's where I really want to make sure we stipulate that point. We're not talking about converting Dungeons & Dragons to Savage Worlds. We're talking about running a fantasy setting or campaign or one-shot in Savage Worlds. And lest I forget, here to discuss it, Dave, the rules baby Scott.
Greetings and salutations.
Chris, the Savage Mommy Fox.
God damn, it's cold.
And hopefully, fingers crossed, due to technical issues, the North American Spotted Jib should be joining us shortly, if he's able. So let's talk about why. Let's say, do you need the fantasy companion?
It's a good book,
all right,
but I don't think you need it.
It's not only is it not, I want to say necessary, but PEG has gone so far as to have a freely available supplement that bridges that gap. If you don't feel like the stuff that's in the core rules handles fantasy completely, they have, I believe it's called Wizards and Warriors.
Yep,
it's a
correct.
free download PDF that you can get. That with that and the free download of the test drive rules, you can play a full fantasy campaign with just those two things. And you haven't bought a thing for Savage Worlds at that point. I don't suggest it. I suggest you actually invest in the books because there's a lot of stuff that gets left out when you get the lightweight version of everything.
Yeah, you're going to get minimal powers, things like that. So you're not going to see all the powers that you might expect to see.
Or all the edges and hindrances.
Right.
So
yeah, you're pretty limited. But you could do it as just a couple hours to give it a shot, see what you think, and see if it's something you want to take a look at the broader rules.
Right. Now, and here's the thing. Even the core rules themselves contain the stats and specs for dwarves, elves, magician, wizards. There's archetypes for that kind of stuff. I mean, it's kind of already preset to have you run fantasy.
And let's be honest, the stats in the core rules for the dwarves, the elves, the orcs, if they don't work for you, you can go right to that making races section and modify them on the fly to make the elves more your version of elves. Because I do believe if we look, the version of elves presented in core versus the version in the fantasy companion, and then the version you could find in something like Shane Tar are different. That doesn't make them unequal, but they are certainly different because they're trying to capture a different flavor with each version.
Right. I think one of the things that the fantasy companion does well, and I will say this about the fantasy companion, I think it does a good job at giving you statted out half breed races, like half elf, half orc. Does a good job in balancing that. It also comes up with a new special type of edge based on race specifically. So there's like a specific edge that only barbarians get, or a specific kind of edge that only elves can take.
Elves are eligible to take.
Right.
And I guess my point on it with the fantasy companion, what it really adds is, just like we've talked about in the past, it adds fine detail knobs to truly tune that in. Things like the troubadour arcane background or the siege rules. The only thing I truly think is in the fantasy companion that you're not going to get anywhere in core is the rules on making magic items. The rules there for magic items really kind of set the standard for any non-standard item in anything that PEG has released since. If you look at the way you can create a magic item there, it's the same way they then go on later and have you build stuff in the sci-fi companion with these extra abilities that get tacked on to a standard item.
Right. And so here's a thing that I think the pitfall to avoid. One of the things I don't like about the sci-fi or the fantasy companion is this magic item creation table. I'm not a fan of it. But more than anything else, I don't like the whole loot generator.
Yeah, it's the random nature of it that I think is off-putting for you.
Well, not so much as because it there's a few things in the fantasy companion that kind of harken into here's how you do D&D. And the two systems are diametrically opposed. D&D, XP can be tied to gold and killing things. Not so with Savage Worlds. Resources in Savage Worlds almost become a plot element where it doesn't really matter. You got how much gold. If you don't really care, then Savage Worlds is really leaned more towards how many ever gold pieces you have. Who gives it? You have what you need. Who gives a flying crap?
Well, I will say I know that the fantasy companion puts forward a Monty Hall loot system. It puts together, if you kill a dragon, this is the loot table that you roll against to see what was in the dragon's hoard. Which is, as you said, very D20-esque, but it's also just the Monty Hall style of gaming. We can look in GURPS and find the exact same type of rules. We can look in, I believe Dungeon World even has some loot rules for things like that. You can find that type of a thing there. I think, though, if you take out the whole random element or the generation of loot and just look at the item, the magical item list and how to, well, here's a sword. Now determine, is it a short sword or a long sword? Now determine, does it have a defensive property or a power on it? I think that's a really good system as a GM to handcraft the few pieces of gear you're going to drop into that game, so that you do have the Sword of Shannara that the players are questing for ages. When they pick it up, it's going to be more than it gives +1 to all dice rolls.
Right. So let's address that topic, because earlier today I pinned a post in the Savage Worlds GM community on Google Plus in anticipation of discussing this tonight. And one of the questions I received an email I put there from Bill Lear. And Bill Lear had asked, as Savage Worlds uses small numbers, it can be hard to give out magic items with bonuses as they can get out of hand. What suggestion do you lovely people have to keep magic items interesting and cool? I take offense to being called lovely. But that aside,
has he watched the show?
I was going to say, he must only listen to us. This was
maybe a listener only. So if
Bill, don't ever tune into these videos, we will sadly disappoint the lovely.
So my answer to that is your +1, +2 magic item, sword or whatever, is pretty much handled by just the character taking the trademark weapon edge. That would be the extent of any kind of bonus I would add to a weapon if I were going to create a fantasy campaign. That's just personal taste. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but
And that works because a +1 and a +2 are big in Savage Worlds. He says we use small numbers, which we do, but they're big numbers because you give something a +2, you're radically changing the probabilities.
Technically speaking, +2 is half a success. I mean, regardless of where it falls within the algorithm, and I know there are people in the Savage Worlds community who are really big on numbers, who could give you an exact ratio of the percentile chance that changes an item. +2 is still half a success. When success is 4, +2 is half of that. So whatever you roll, let's assume that everything is shooting for a 4, and you get +2. That means you're already at a 3, even if you roll double ones.
Right.
I mean, that's big. That said, I don't know that I would give out gear with a lot of pluses on it. I'm gonna more lean toward here's an item that also comes with the armor power and this many power points to activate it in the item, and that maybe refreshes once a day or once a week or whatever. Here's something that grants you the monstrous ability regeneration, and it, so long as you have it on your person, you get the benefit of whatever that is. That's more, I think, where magic items, even in D&D and other games like it, should have gone, but the mechanics of those games demanded that you have this ever-increasing bonus that goes along with things. So they had to give the whole +1, +2, +4 versions of stuff. Savage Worlds doesn't. You can make a character who's got a D12 fighting at novice. You don't ever need a +1 on that character that you're not already getting from your skills and your edges. I think it just is a lot more interesting to start having, here's your Sword of Ogre Slaying. Well, what it does is it has a boost lower trait that reduces the vigor of ogres when you hit with it. It's only useful against ogres. It only reduces vigor. So it's only a lower vigor against ogres. But a successful hit automatically lowers it, make your dice roll and see how much you lowered it by. I think that's a very interesting way to take that using the powers and stuff that are already inside.
Right. And what you're essentially doing is I agree with Dave. What you're talking about doing for a magical item, whether that be a ring, keychain, boots, I don't care what it is, a cloak, whatever it is, it's basically a weird science device.
Sure.
At the end of the day. And then you can really dial it in and tone it in. And then you already have a complete set of rules for how a weird science device works.
Yeah, because I gave a player in a Deadlands game, I don't remember all of the items, but 2 items I know I gave. I gave one was a pair of goggles that just basically took the darkness penalties down a step. And then the other one was whatever the Native American chest pieces. I don't know what they're called, but it was made out of bones and things, and it actually gave a +1 toughness.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which is really, and at that point, goggles that reduce darkness penalties, that's nothing more than low light vision.
Right. Yep.
The armor that's giving +1 toughness. Well, one, you're not calling it armor, but it's really doing exactly what armor does.
Yeah.
You're just allowing it not to be affected by AP. Right. But if we look, that's no more powerful than an edge.
Right.
There are edges that do exactly that. So I think a lot of people don't look at, well, what happens if I have a gun that gives me the marksman's edge? I don't have to ever take it. If I'm using that gun, I automatically have access to the marksman's edge. Does it really does it really overpower your game? I don't think so.
Yeah, what if you have a sword or a bow? You have a bow and it's got the quick draw edge. So like the arrows just come right into your hand. The second you put your hand back here, the bow thing puts an arrow on your hand. Way cool, way easy to do in Savage Worlds. You just say it has a static effect. Or like we were saying, you could create it as a weird science item. You could have it have a limited number of power points in it.
Yeah.
Like it's only certain charged to a number of power points. And once they go through those with the power, boop, it turns to basically brass or whatever.
Give a character a longbow. Call it the longbow of never ending. And they've got their own quiver of arrows they can use, but the longbow comes charged with the bolt power. It doesn't consume arrows. Instead, it consumes its power points. And when they're out of arrows, they can just start shooting magical arrows. It's the same damage they would do with the bow anyway.
Right.
And now they're just consuming power points. They're using the same stat. Because again, if we're referring back to the rules for a weird science device, a weapon that's shot or a weapon that's swung, use shooting or fighting. And then if you want to have the specialty character, the guy who can use any magic item, well, lo and behold, he buys this little skill called magic item use, and any item that he doesn't have a stat for that under weird science would be a weird science roll. They roll magic item use to be able to use that item. Done.
Now that bow sounds a little bit like Hank's from the D&D cartoon.
Yeah, except that Hank's had maybe a few more power points.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and you can do the same thing. If you take a look at, I know the Fantasy Companion has it. It also appears in Deadlands Reloaded, the new background alchemy edge. You basically use that to create weird science devices as potions.
Yep.
So if you want to have potions of healing or whatever, potions of cure light wounds, not to marry it directly to D&D, but the same kind of, this automatically relieves any fatigue.
So I think I would throw out too that, to be honest with you, I don't think magic items carry the same weight or even need to as a D&D game. They're just not as important in Savage Worlds, I don't think.
No.
I mean, you could get through an entire fantasy campaign and never hand out a magic item, and I think you would be just fine.
Mechanically, I don't disagree. Narratively, I think they carry a lot more weight than they do.
Yeah.
A magic item in Savage Worlds is more like, let's compare this to what a lot of geeks would hold up as the carte blanche, this is the standard in Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is kind of your fantasy standard. Well, Aragorn's sword, the shards of Narsil that get, reforged, that's a magical sword. And it's one of the very few magic items that exist in that world. There's a handful of cloak brooches and cloaks themselves. There's 3 total swords that get names. There's a single dagger that gets a name. There are very few actual magic items that exist in that world there, and they're all very precious. No one goes into the local shop, throws the thing up on the counter and says, "How many gold pieces will you give me for that? I want to upgrade to the one you got on the mantle behind you." It's just not the way it works. And in D&D, again, because their mechanics are so rooted in it, it has to be the way that works for them. I think a lot of the players, funnily enough, a lot of players have those iconic heroes from like the D&D novels or the stories that have come out over the years that they want to recreate. You can do so a lot easier in Savage Worlds than you can in D&D. I've got the whole Driz hate in my tag there, but quite honestly, at the end of the day, Driz Do'Urden ran around with named scimitars. He didn't upgrade them every few levels. He didn't toss them out and pick up new ones because he was more powerful and that bonus wasn't as good as it used to be. No, he carried the same ones for a long time. Well, in Savage Worlds, you could absolutely do that. You could have a character who was very accomplished as a swordsman and had these heirloomish weapons that he's carried for 100 years. And it wouldn't feel out of sorts. You wouldn't feel like you were harming your character. In D&D, you go more than 5 levels without upgrading a piece of gear, you're going to feel that difference mechanically.
That's a good point. I would also put out there that I'm picking up echo from somebody. I think it's probably Dave. Let me mute you here for just a second to find out. So I would argue, I would argue that it's going to depend on your conception of what a fantasy campaign should be in your world. If you want to go with classic Tolkien, magic items are rare, or if it is a magical item, you better bet it's a relic from a bygone age and it's thousands of years old. The Ring of Invisibility is not just a Ring of Invisibility. Oh, no. It's the main ring, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. You can do that. You could just as easily go, no, magic in this world is a little bit more, like we build steam or magically powered robots as golems. We have, iron golems that we power with magic. It depends on what your style of fantasy is. And if you want to do something, the closest I think you can probably get to is like a gnome. I think in a lot of the D&D, some of the later editions where it's more of they're a steampunk tinkerer who could create ingenious little mechanical devices. Go ahead and that's weird science. That's all that is. That's all you need. Oh, well, I want to create a bard. There's no class for bard, Dave. How do I play a bard? Well, you take the arcane background magic. Or miracles,
magic,
maybe.
or psionics. I don't care which one. And
you trap it as audio. Your powers work when you're playing on a lute or singing a tune.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't there actually a sound trapping listed in core that has rules on what the effects are of having a sound trapping?
Yeah, boy. Yes, indeedy.
But it's too easy. It's too damn easy. It's got to be harder than that. Doesn't it? Doesn't it have to be difficult?
So let's talk about that for a second. Because I think even we've suffered this in the past where we over-tinkered with something and then realized, well, no, there's a fucking simple answer that keeps it fast, furious, and fun at the table. Go with the simple answer.
Well, like, just for example, wait, then I would need a perform skill. No, you don't.
Persuasion.
It could be persuasion. You can make the arcane skill whatever you would like to make the arcane skill. Boys and girls. If you're going to go, you know what? I'm a bard. I'm going to take the miracles. And instead of faith, I'm going to call it perform. Who gives a shit? It's still going to be linked to an attribute, and you're still going to have to advance it.
A sin as a bard, since you're using miracles as the backbone of it, and it deals specifically with if your character commits a sin against their faith, they start having problems. Well, a sin could be a bad performance or refusing to perform. Think of as a player, separate yourself and go. Mechanically, this is asking for the character does something wrong and there's a punishment for it. Find what works for, I'm going to make it a performer and it's a bad performance, or it's refusing to sing the song that the tavern requested that night or whatever.
Or you didn't practice 4 hours that day. You didn't run scales that day. I think maybe miracles is a bad, not really good analog for bard, as perhaps maybe magic would be. And I'm going to say this.
I would use magic.
I'm going to say this for this reason. The way arcane background miracles is kind of set up, and some of the edges it gives you access to are analogous to cleric and paladin as a class.
And honestly, I think that fits the bard better than the mage. If we stop and we think about the role that has played in most of the fantasy settings, the bard is a crowd controller or a supporter. They rally their own team. They reduce the enemy team by giving these battle songs as everyone charges into battle. They aren't strumming their lute and having large fireballs erupt in the midst of the enemy.
That's a very good point.
Feel that the magic user wizard type fits the bard as well. Now, that said, maybe in your world it does, and that's the whole reason why. Don't marry yourself to this idea that an arcane background is what it's named either. You know, let's be honest. Savage Worlds doesn't say that arcane background faith can't take the bolt power, nor does it say that arcane background magic can't take the healing power. That's it. That's something that you as a player and as a GM decide if it fits your campaign world.
Yep. That's a very salient point. I hadn't considered the bard not being just a magic wielder. But so
all right, 1 point for Dave.
So
if this is a point-by system, I think we're screwed.
Now, one of the other questions we got on the post was if you were going to make a new setting rule to really give a Savage fantasy setting the extra fantasy genre feeling, what would it be? And then what edges or hindrances would you restrict for your fantasy setting? None of them. I would not restrict. I can't think of an edge right off the top of my head or a hindrance that I would restrict just because we're in a fantasy setting.
I think it depends very much on the flavor of fantasy you're going for. If you're going for a Renaissance era fantasy setting, then maybe you do have things like Bad Eyes Minor as well as Major, where the character can have glasses that they're dependent upon. But if you're in a lower tech version, maybe you're in a more true Dark Ages fantasy, then something like Bad Eyes should be restricted to Major only, because there aren't prescription glasses out there available for the character to pick up. They're either at the penalty or they're not. They don't have that middle ground to being dependent on an item. You also might want to look at something like illiterate. Maybe carte blanche, everyone in the world is illiterate, and you have to buy literacy as an edge to rise yourself up above the common masses. Again, a lower tech or even a burgeoning tech world might see, if all the players are playing commoners, they don't read and write. They've never had a formal education. That may not exist in your fantasy world. Reverse that and go with a more Forgotten Realms-esque or Eberron. Eberron is really big in guilds and all these different clan houses and stuff where they would have formal education and schools that player characters might have gone to. So in those cases, the characters maybe are literate and can have, Bad Eyes at a minor, but then that might also restrict some edges. You have to, I think, take it on a case-by-case basis. It's not a fantasy demands that we throw out this particular edge or that particular hindrance. Even Marksman, which deals a lot with shooting, well, anybody who has a game with archery in it can benefit from that just as much as anybody who advances that to a Warhammer fantasy where they've got all their player characters running around with blunderbusses and black powder pistols. Marksman's just as useful there as well. So I think fantasy, because it's such a broad category, it's hard to say, no, this edge or hindrance doesn't fit. I think you really have to tailor it to what you're playing, no different than you do anything else with Savage Worlds.
I would say I think we're kind of all on the same court, on the same page. When we say fantasy, we're pretty much all referring to Western medieval fantasy.
Yes, that's that's what I think of basically.
Well, but again, that can run the gamut from your Dark Ages fantasy to your high magic technology steampunk runepunk fantasy to your Warhammer fantasy role playing, which is very much like right before the Industrial Revolution. but it all fits that same fantasy thing. I'm not talking about, sword and sandal barbarians where we're talking Conan. I'm talking traditional Western fantasy, but there's a pretty wide array of that.
And I would say that the only thing I can think of in a fantasy setting where that doesn't quite fit would be maybe rock and roll. Anything that has to do with full automatic weapons. Yeah, but even that, if you make a Gatling, or a crossbow that has a repeating crossbow,
a repeating crossbow might exist, or something that has, I played in a game one time where a guy had multiple magic wands set up on a spindle with a barrel, and he cranked a handle and the wands rotated around, and he just, as he cranked this handle, he sang the power word and had a Gatling fireball launcher.
Yeah. So I don't see any real edges or hindrances that I would exclude in a just blanket fantasy. Setting rules are less about genre and more about your world.
What kind of tone do you want to set? I think that's has to do with it too. With setting rules, is the tone of the game.
Yeah, I was going to say play style factors a big thing because, take a look at the differences between, say, Hellfrost and Shantar. Both are fantasy, but both have a very different play style at the table. And because of that, the setting rules really make them feel different. Beyond just the feeling of the world, but the feeling as a player playing that game.
Right. And then it depends on, what is your fantasy world? I think the most critical thing to pay attention to if you're going to run fantasy in Savage Worlds is not what are the stats for a dwarf? How do we do magic items? How does armor work? What powers are available? All of that is so much chuffa, so much minutia in comparison to what is the world like.
Are there floating castles in your world? Or do you have airships in your world? Do you have, magical portals that everyone has access to? So every major town has a portal in the middle of town that can take you to any other major town in that magical network.
Right. How many kingdoms are there? And what are kingdoms based on? Are all the dragons based on seasonal or earth, wind, winter, fire? So like ice, fire, earth, and spirit or whatever, air. Are they based on elements? And then therefore there's only 4 kingdoms and only the kingdoms exist because that king originally conquered one of those dragons? Is that why that kingdom exists? Who makes up that kingdom? Maybe the dwarves conquered or subjugated the Earth Dragon, and that's why they have a dwarven kingdom. Are dwarves stoneworkers in your setting? Maybe not. Maybe you flip the script and you say, no, what elves are in classic fantasy is what dwarves are, and what dwarves are in classic fantasy is what elves are. So you have completely subterranean elven.
Or you go the route of our esteemed Scott W., who unfortunately isn't here tonight, and you say, fuck it, I'm not including any of the fantasy races. Only man exists in this world. And it's kingdoms of men who face off against each other. It's a more medieval reality version of fantasy where there aren't elven kingdoms and dwarven kingdoms and orcish kingdoms where this kingdom is all good because they're the high elves and this kingdom is all bad because they're the dark elves. No, this kingdom is the kingdom of Albion and they want these things, and this kingdom is the kingdom of Bretonia and they want these things, and they've been at war forever because they want opposing things on the same piece of land.
Right. Is magic commonplace, or is it against the law and it's done in secret and in private, or is it just very, very, very fucking rare? Maybe the only way you gain access to magic is by subjugating your life to a deity. Maybe that's the only access to magic.
Or a demon.
or a demon
maybe
for that matter.
That's why it's illegal, is that you have to have made a deal, a pact with some demonic force to have access to magic, and therefore you're hunted as consorting with demons.
Or you make a pact with L. Ron Hubbard.
No, or if you made a pact with demons, maybe you don't use arcane background magic, use arcane background psionics for the brain burn and the when you lose control of it. How deadly is magic in your world? How lethal is your world? Is it a gritty, dark Game of Thrones style fantasy that we're dealing with, or is it complete off the rails video game style where you just whatever, I got unlimited lives and
you
the
could walk in
3 times bigger than I am and I don't give a shit.
You could walk into a store and buy an item that quite literally brings your fellows back from the dead, or is undeath a real concern, and someone who is seen to die gets put down by the local town if they are ever seen walking around again, because oh my god, it's an undead, kill it.
Right. It's more about world building and play style and fine tuning that with your players. And here's one thing that you get to do in Savage Worlds that you don't necessarily get to do in D&D or a pre-established fantasy setting. You get to sit down with your players and fucking decide. You get to custom tailor the game. So if you got a bunch of people I've played D&D for 30 years, I want to try Savage Worlds and I want to do fantasy. You go, great. What does our fantasy world look like? What are your expectations at the game table? Are there magic items everywhere? Are we playing more Eberron fantasy? Are we playing more original OSR feel? What are you looking for? And you can figure out what those paradigms are of gameplay. And the thing is, you don't have to do any heavy lifting with Savage Worlds. You do have to do a little bit of creative thinking when it comes to Savage Worlds. Like,
the
okay,
rules
wait,
don't change as much as what do you want it to look like, smell like, feel like in your world, and then just apply the rules the way they're written.
Like we were saying earlier, there's no arcane background bard. Right. Because you get to choose what arcane background bard looks like. And then just pick up the arcane background that works best for the way you conceive it.
Maybe arcane background bard in your game is the arcane background superpowers from core, where that bard might only ever have 2 magical songs they sing. Ever. But right. They're really freaking good at those 2 songs because they've put all their time and effort into mastering that. Maybe that captures that feel that you're looking for. You are free, absolutely free to make those choices before your game starts or even in the midst of play. This is an interesting aspect. With Savage Worlds, it's not that hard to change something up while you're playing and still be following the rules. A great example of this is you got some player characters who've gone into a dungeon, and all of a sudden they find, they made a successful notice roll and they notice some, trail of stuff that leads around a corner. So they know the monster that's around that corner left behind this trail. And somebody says, well, I have this knowledge dungeoneering skill. I want to roll that. And they roll all the successes ever. You can look at them as a GM and go, what's around the corner? And then you can say, and what are the properties of that? And you can pull out your race creator and build that on the fly, and all your monstrous abilities are there, all your edges, hindrances, racial bonuses are all available to just be slotted in, and then you've just created a brand new monstrous creature that your players helped invent and make that game more real for them. Whereas you're not having to go find a compendium of 80,000 existing monsters and flip through it till you find the one that your players want to fight against that night.
Right, and you could do. Let's give an example for just creative thinking and applying something in a fantasy setting. Let's say they all arrive at a banquet hall. We're in a kind of Tolkien type fantasy setting. They arrive at a banquet hall. And they're feasting with the king before going on a long trek after such and such questable MacGuffin in the morning. And there is an alluring woman who is basically the king's consort and advisor in that world. And she does not like your adventurers. She does not want what the king wants to happen to succeed because it usurps her power. So she drugs the entire party and everybody there and puts them into an illusionary coma. How do you abdicate that in Savage Worlds? Well, first of all, you can do it a couple ways. It could be she just imbues their drinks with the puppet power, and they all have a shared illusion.
I don't even think I would have to call it the puppet power. I would just go dilute, and we would run the rest of the session, and I would be describing what's happening to them. And at the end of it, I would do the DM mic drop, and you all wake up.
Or, well, if you want to give them a chance by the rules, that's what I'm saying. If you don't want to just, of course, you can always GM fiat.
I was going to say, we've talked about that in the show before, where you're having that James Bond moment where you're having dinner with the villain and they spiked the drinks. Well, there's no roll. You drank it down. I don't need to know if you fall to the magic dust or whatever.
But if you want one of the characters or any of the members of the party to have a chance, you could just go, what are the rules for poison? Oh, there we go. If you imbue poison. Okay. And then give them all a roll to resist it.
Yeah, give them a notice. Give them a notice versus stealth roll to see her pour it in their drink. Yeah. Or to notice the rim of the cup shimmers differently. I don't care.
Or it tastes different.
Yeah.
Wait, how do I? Well, then, okay. What do I use to cast an illusion on a character as a magic user? As a player, I want to cast an illusion on the orcs to make them think they're fighting a hill troll.
Spend 2 power points and give me a persuasion roll.
We're talking core rules.
I'm talking core rules. You're an illusion caster. You have an arcane background that gives you the ability to cast illusions. I'm not even going to require you have a power that does that. That's a cantrip level. All magic users can make little shit shimmer in the air. Spend a couple of power points and give me a persuasion roll. That's how convincing your illusion is.
Okay, then let's talk cantrips. Do you just allow them to have certain things that they just do narratively because it's fucking cool and they just do it narratively? Like, I can always cause a little thing of flame to come off my thumb to light a pipe. I could cause something light, not heavy weight, but to levitate across the room to me.
So
why?
Long as it
because I'm a user.
So long as it doesn't take away from an existing power, what is that? Elemental manipulation is the ability to control an already existing element.
Right.
But light my pipe, I don't need you to actually give me a spellcasting roll for elemental manipulation because you're not bending fire from across the room to do anything. You're flicking your pipe and lighting it. So that's going to be free. But if you want to do I make all the candle flames get up and dance in the middle of the room, that's going to be elemental manipulation. Give me a roll.
And I would say for an illusion, couldn't you, and you could trap it, couldn't you use summon ally?
Depends on what you want the illusion to be. Maybe it's an illusionary wall,
but your allies. In Jared's example, we want the orcs to think they're fighting a storm giant. So you use summon ally, and your ally is an illusionary storm giant.
Could work. I would say you could also just make it the puppet power and trap it as an illusion.
You could. The only difference I have with that is typically puppet's going to be used to give commands.
Right.
So you could say that they're getting that,
and that's commands.
Spirit fighting roll. A hill troll. You can give them that spirit roll to break free and notice that it's an illusion occasionally as you give them, different scenes. But when I think of you've got this advisor to the king who's going to cast an illusion over the entire party. The party is in their beds in the king's castle sleeping that night, and they think they've gone off on the quest. to me, that's what we were talking about. If we're talking about specifically, like, you're in the middle of combat, and I'm going to make all the commoners in the banquet hall look like orcs so that the player characters jump up and slaughter the court. Oh, that is absolutely puppet very easily. It's also very easily the summon ally, like Chris is talking about, where, you know, I make all of these people look like orcs by summoning orcs.
Cool. So,
but as far as like your standard cantrip, I would absolutely allow players to do some of that stuff. And I would even go so far as to say, you know, take some of the powers that are in there and maybe give them innately to your character if you're playing a very magic heavy game. If your fantasy world is beyond Tolkien, maybe it's more that, you know, that computer role-playing game, Final Fantasy-esque thing, where the magic user never ever pulls out a sword or a crossbow. They are always standing in the back throwing firebolts. Then that character has Bolt with unlimited power points. It's really no different than that character walking around with you know, an unlimited number of arrows and a quiver for a bow. They're just rolling a attack roll with their bolt and doing 2d6 points of damage. It doesn't offset your game that much to give that character this ability to constantly throw bolts of fire, and then they have to buy the other powers for the stuff that they want to be able to do wizardly. That can be, you know, but again, it's whether it fits in your game. In Tolkien, we don't see Gandalf casting a lot of spells. You know, he's not running around with magical spells that answer every solution, you know, every situation they're in. So
let's talk Glamdring, for example, in Lord of the Rings, or what Bilbo ends up naming Sting in The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. That is a magic item that has what? Danger Sense Goblin?
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, it's just as easy as it is. It has Danger Sense Goblin.
Yeah.
And the trapping is whenever a goblin is within a large burst template, it glows.
Which gives you that +2 against ambush. Done.
So that's kind of what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, about doing fantasy right, doing it with Savage Worlds. It's not trying to recreate everything you've ever seen from D&D. If a character goes, well, I usually play a paladin. That's great. You can take arcane background miracles. You can have some powers. Well, but I also want to be a good fighter. That's fine too. Savage Worlds will let you do that. Go over there and buy that. Well, but I also want to be a learned person. Great. There's an option for that. I want to be a combat ranger with magical powers. Okay, great. Be a combat ranger with magical powers. Rock out with your dick out. Go ahead. Go for it.
Don't forget by two-fisted and by dexterity.
Woodsman
Edge. The Woodsman's Edge.
Yeah. And I'm just going to buy the smite power. I'm going to buy the smite power. I'm going to buy the boost lower trait power. And that's it. And it's just all in my hand. I have to touch it.
I'm only ever going to pay for fighting up to a D8. And then I'm going to cast boost lower trait as my first action every combat and hope for 2 successes to get me to the D12.
Yep. Or I'm going to go up against an enemy, and because I have to, I'm going to hit him with the little boost lower, and I'm going to bring his vigor down, which lowers his toughness down, hopefully 2 steps, which is a massive drop in overall toughness. And then now I'm just going to cast smite on my weapon in the other hand and just hack and slash on him. Oh, and I'm also a ranger because I have the Woodsman's Edge. There you go. Done. You could be literally anything you could be. So all the haters who have said all Savage Worlds characters are the same, I say go spit, to quote Danny Glover from Lethal Weapon. No, I would say D&D is actually true of that. All characters are the same. You're either a certain class, and all those classes are exactly the same. There's not variety in there. Savage Worlds, we don't have a class system.
Wait. You mean my character can wear heavy armor and cast fireballs and carry a staff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't have to buy his powers to figure out what he's going to use at the beginning of the day. He, at will, just cast whatever he wants.
That's too easy, Jared.
Oh, but it's not going to be lethal enough. Okay, so let's address that very quickly. We're going to wrap that up real quick. Well, how do you challenge players in Savage Worlds? I mean, it's so easy with bennies to soak and all that. I mean, it's not like a Savage Worlds character has 300 hit points that you have to whittle down.
That's right. It's not attrition. God damn it.
I mean, how do you challenge him going up against a legendary red dragon? Or, an ancient red dragon. How do you challenge him? Well, okay, guess what?
Stop conflating, because you've just asked two very different questions. And I know that it doesn't necessarily sound that way, but I mean, let's break that down for a second. The hit points versus wounds conversation is a deep conversation. But how do I, make a red dragon imposing and a challenge to my players? Well, the red dragon lives in a volcano. So your players are facing all the hazards of fighting in a goddamn volcano. And, oh, by the way, the dragon can fly. Just a little thing I want you to remember. That dragon can fly and fight. It's got a lot that it can do already. Multi-action, frenzy. Take a look at the advanced version, improved frenzy. The dragon now tail slaps and bites you in the same round with no penalties. Mm-hmm. Guys, I'm here to tell you, D&D dragons really can't hold a candle to Savage Worlds dragons. Pussies. But with that said, the whole HP versus wounds. Well, I mean, one. If you've never played in a game and seen somebody pick up a D4 -2 and roll a 78, you just simply haven't played enough Savage Worlds, because it's going to happen. And it actually happens with enough regularity that we all scoff at the idea of an unskilled being a challenge anymore. With that said, the flip side is also true of you can have a D12 and miss all night long just because you get on a cold streak, or you're facing off against somebody who is actually fighting from behind cover in a darkened alley. So the hit points thing is supposed to be, because that system is so easy to hit, and you just walk up and stand toe-to-toe with your enemy till one of us falls down. Hit points is supposed to cover dodging, and a loss of hit points isn't I hit you and took away meat. It's maybe I pushed you slightly out of position. Well, in Savage Worlds, we call that shaken, and it actually has a mechanical effect. We don't take it away from you hit points. The other aspect of it is, quite simply, if you don't like the way the wounds work, there's a lot, and I mean a lot, of setting rules.
Yep.
All of them are called gritty damage. They're in multiple different sources, and each one of them fucks your day up.
Listen, if you get incapacitated in Savage Worlds, that means you go through all your wounds, and you're dick in the dirt. Doesn't mean you're unconscious. It just means you're done. Then you have to make a vigor roll with all three of those -3 penalties. By the way, and hope you don't fail.
If you have fatigue,
yeah,
because if you had fatigue, then it could be up to a -5 to that roll.
Yep. And then understand that if you roll under a 4, which seems like, oh, come on, no big deal. But if you've got a D8, a D6, and they can explode, and you're rolling at a -3, guess what? It happens more times than you think it may. You could end up with I rolled a 3. Oh, congratulations. You have a permanent injury, and you're bleeding out. You're about to die. I got a 1 or less.
Dead.
Bye. You're
Yeah.
dead.
Yeah.
Dead.
Oh, and by the way, when you're dead, your new character that you get to roll up to replace it is 1 advance lower than the character you were playing when you died. Right. That's not me being a dick. That's core rules. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some settings out there that do away with that. There are some settings that are like, no, you start over at novice.
Yeah.
Welcome to the party, pal.
You know that allied extra that's been following you around? Say hello to your new character. Yeah, and it's GM field at that point. So, with that in mind, I'm gonna wrap up the show. That being said, if you have any other questions about fantasy setting, feel free to participate in the Savage Worlds GM Hangout community on Google Plus and post to that pin. But for now, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dave and Chris saying keep rolling, stay savage.